All right, I'm here with two very smart ladies, Elizabeth Hovde of the Washington Policy Center and Bernadette Pajer, Informed Life Radio and Informed Choice Washington. And we are talking about something that has been inundating my email and text messages. And when I got a hold of both of you, same thing for you all. It's like a nonstop barrage of people freaking out. And I will just say before I get into my questions for you all, that I want to preface this. I feel like we're at a time where it's hard to know whether the division and the paranoia is something that is organically coming out of a very upside down world, or if it is being stoked as a fire in order to, I think, push the public or the world, society, right, in a certain direction. And so that's a big question I have for you all, like the intentions behind some of the misinformation that gets out there. But this is one of the articles that I got, American Faith, and it's written by InfoWars. Washington State announces plans for strike force to involuntarily detain the unvaxxed. And they showed the WAC 246-100-040 procedures for isolation or quarantine. And I'll just read it real fast because, you know, on first read, it sounds concerning. At his or her sole discretion, a local health officer may issue an emergency detention order causing a person or group of persons to be immediately detained for purposes of isolation or quarantine in accordance with this subsection of this section, or may petition the Superior Court ex parte for an order to take the person or group of persons into involuntary detention for purposes of isolation or quarantine in accordance with subsection of this section. And it goes on to say that they have to make reasonable efforts first to give you the voluntary option to comply with whatever it is. So then you read the article and it says this emergency detention order would allow citizens to be voluntarily detained and put in isolation and quarantine at the discretion of state health officials or authorities. The state of Washington may amend a law to allow the forcible detainment of residents into COVID internment camps for defying state vaccine mandates. And so that's what's going around. People freaking out that if you are going to choose opposite from the mandates in Washington State, then you could be forcibly put into some kind of internment camp. So let's talk about the truth of what's going on. Would either one of you like to tackle this first? I could show Elizabeth's article. Maybe you could talk to us first, and we'll go to Bernadette. You wrote this: misinformation about a January 12th State Board of Health meeting was easy for many to believe.
Yeah, you know, this started going around, and like all of you, it was coming from sources who are normally passing around information that is credible. And so it was definitely something I called around about to see what was going on. And the agenda that is included in most of the communications I received is not the same agenda that is online. There's a section within the social media messages or the emails that said there are these proposed policies, and he just went over one of them. And at the end of the day, those proposed policies aren't listed on the agenda. They're not policies. There are discussions happening about various COVID related mandates, or not mandates, issues. But for one, the one that talks about involuntary quarantine is being misrepresented. It actually relates to House Bill, I think it's 1551, and they need to update administrative changes to it that were made, you know, before COVID was even a thing. Involuntary quarantine power is in the law, and while it's unthinkable, it's been unthinkable in the past. In the last 2 years, because of all the coercive mandates and the ostracization of unvaccinated people, the unthinkable seems thinkable now. And I think that's the main point for policy leaders to take away, is that this misinformation got way out of control because people have been ostracized and demonized, and there's mandates and firings and closures.
Before we get to the rest of this video, don't forget you can support my work by also checking out my sponsors and having a glass of wine or a cup of coffee in honor of free speech. The first is AllisonWinePromo.com, Allison with 1L winepromo.com. You get 50% off of my favorite Argentinian Malbecs and 50% off of shipping. They have switched out the 3 bottles from the last pairing, so check them out. Many of these are high altitude wines. They're very robust. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. But if you need something to wake you up, like a strong cup of coffee, check out twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. They've got a wide variety of roasts. These are high altitude, shade grown Nicaraguan coffees that are also USDA certified organic. Check out my sponsors and support free speech wherever you are.
First of all, I want to really clarify that that section of law about quarantine that was in that article you showed at the very beginning and had come from InfoWars, that section of law is from 2003. Okay, this is not a new section of law. This is not something new being added. This is from 2003.
Right.
It happens to be in WAC 246-100, which contains language about HIV, and it's the sections pertaining to HIV and sexual transmitted diseases that the Board of Health has been updating for 2 years because of legislation that passed in 2020, where they're calling it modernizing the language, just changing some terms and having it fall into line with something that passed in 2020 about HIV, okay? So when people saw on the agenda that WAC number, and it wasn't -040, it was just -100, they went and looked at the entire section of law because they didn't know, they didn't understand there was an open rule to change the language about HIV. And they read all of it and were quite alarmed. And I understand they would be alarmed. And but that's how it happened. I believe it was a very honest mistake. And it was, I believe it was fueled by the fact that outside of the law with the emergency orders in Washington State, there's been a lot of language about quarantine. And in fact, Washington State has set up COVID-19 quarantine facilities, right? So there are things happening. But that has nothing to do with the discussion on Wednesday and the section of the WAC that is going to be talked about. So I emailed the board and told the staff that, hey, we've got, the public is going nuts here because they're looking at your bare bones agenda and making assumptions about what you're talking about because they don't, they haven't been following you. So they issued this statement to explain.
Is there anything either one of you all would like to add? I really appreciate your time and thank you for guest hosting while I ran and got the producer.
Sure. We didn't get down to the really good agenda item that I would love to cover.
Let me go back to that.
Okay.
Yes, this is what
And before we get there, I just really want to stress that people pay attention to this emergency reform legislation and talk that's going on. That would take a lot of the worry away, I think, to not have one-man rule over these kinds of situations. COVID is no longer an emergency. Emergency rule is not appropriate.
Yeah, do you have a bill number for that?
Point that it's much more difficult to either hoodwink or enervate or agitate or whatever you want to call it, people who are informed and people and it's much easier when people are just already distanced from their political system, their health system, whatever else is going on, whether, whatever it is we're talking about, it's much easier to do damage to people who don't pay attention. And I think this is perhaps for my lifetime, one of the greatest examples of the need for people to be engaged in their civic life.
Yeah.
And how great for us to be aware of this WAC that under emergency powers could be a problem.
Yeah. Right? And, I mean, that was sort of my takeaway, even before I talked to the two of you about the false stuff that was circulating, was just like, wait, this already exists. Like, see, this is the thing that COVID has brought to our attention about a lot of things. where like, wait a second, that was already on the books, like that law already existed. And that was a wake up call, I think, for a lot of us, that this didn't just come out of nowhere, that we've been building in a direction, and this has allowed people to capitalize on a foundation for a house that was already being built. This is just a short clip of a full video that has basically been sanitized so it can fly under the radar on YouTube. If you want to see the entire conversation that we had, or the entirety of the commentary that you're watching, please go to one of my other platforms. One of the best places to go is AllisonMorrow.locals.com, where you can become part of my editorial board and pose questions ahead of time for interviews. I also do live editorial board meetings on Saturdays. You can bring your feedback and pose ideas for guests and topics for the week to come, and you get exclusive content. So go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com, but whatever you do, don't stay here on YouTube. If you want the full truth about what's happening around us, you gotta go somewhere else.